Hey everybody, today we're going to be working with functions in JavaScript. We're using Visual Studio Code for our development environment today, which has been set up for JavaScript debugging along with a Chrome extension, which will open the Chrome window whenever we need to display our web page, and it does that completely automatically. Now, what we do for functions are very useful because whenever you want to have a situation, you want to have a section of code that you use repeatedly, you can give it a name and you can call it or invoke it or what's executing that code. And what it does is it actually simplifies and makes your program much easier to understand. So and also it's valuable because you can create these functions that you don't really have to understand exactly how they work. I mean, you could have a function as sophisticated as, say, recognize a face, and you could pass it an image and any faces in there, the function would pass back the locations of, or the count of the faces in that image. So the sky's the limit is there, and functions are an integral part of pretty much any programming language. So, and the way this works, and now I'm going to go back and show you how you get started in the easy way using Visual Studio Code's template. So I just start off typing fu, ends up giving me the function, and so the function definition starts off with function, then we have name followed by any number of parameters, and the parameter is a value that is passed into the function, and then we use those variables or values inside this particular section of code. Now what follows the parameters, which are in parentheses, so then after that we have these braces. Inside the brace you would have some kind of code. In here we'll just put in some code. We'll put in return. Now the return function tells the function to end and to pass back a value if you want, or you could not pass in a value, not pass back a value. So in this case we're going to square some values. I'm going to set my parameter to x, and I'm going to make the name of my function be my square So now I have a function my square. So and again, so what's happened whenever this function gets called, we're going to pass a value into this variable x. Again, this is known as a parameter, like it's going to show us here. And then it's going to pass into this code, and we only have one line of code, and all it has to do is multiply x by x and send that value back to the called instance of this particular function. So now if I run this through the debugger, and I'll put a breakpoint on the only line of code that I have. I mean, this line of code is basically a definition. It doesn't really execute in any way, but this is an actual line of code. Now if I say I'd like to run this, then it has already run, but we note that it has not hit this breakpoint, and that's because in this particular case, this is a definition or declaration of the function. It doesn't do anything until it's called. Actually, so here's our debugging tools, and again, you have to wait until you've this actually kind of shows that it's still running. And will continue to do so until this window is closed, or you can click on the stop button to end it. So we can see there that as soon as I click the close on that Chrome window, the the debugging process stops and my debugging window goes away. So as we saw, nothing actually happens. So what we need to do is call this function. Now, you can actually use this function. You can call the function even if you've defined it before or after. So I could put a function call, and the way we do a function call is the following. We just simply say, we'll assign this to a value. Y is equal to my SQU followed by some sort of number. We'll just put in the value 5. So now what's going to happen is if I execute this code, it's going to hit this particular line of code. It's going to make a call to the mySQU function, and we're going to pass in a 5, and this value is considered an argument. So an argument ends up being passed in as into the parameter of that called function. So we have the two things that happen when you call a function. One is that the control or the next line of code becomes this function, and then after this is done, it's going to return to here and pass the value in if you've assigned it to a variable. In this case, we've assigned mySQU to the variable y, and then it will proceed to pass on to the next whatever the next line of code is. So we could have something like y equals y plus 1, for example. So if I were to demonstrate how exactly this works, and we have, well, let's put a breakpoint here on the very first line of code, and this time let's see if the function is called so that this line of code is executed. So I'll click on my green rectangle, Chrome pops up, and the first thing we have is this first line of code. Now note that this line has not executed yet. This yellow, as you can see, the yellow looks like a sideways house there. That is a cursor indicating where I'm at in the program. But we'll put my breakpoint back, and so what's happened now is this has called the function mySQU, so the names match. It's a reference to call that function. We've passed in the value of 5 into the parameter x, and again, now keep in mind this value, the name of the parameter could be anything. You could call it x, y, z, number, whatever you'd like. As long as it's not a reserved word, it's perfectly valid, and it doesn't really matter. It's just a substitute for a value, just like you have in a math problem. So, and as we can see here, I move the cursor over that x. X is now equal to 5 because that argument's 5. And then as we come down here, we can execute the next line of code. But what it did is it took x times x, passed that back, and since x was 5, x times x is 25, so y is now equal to 25. And now we come to this next line of code, which is going to basically just add 1 to that y value of 25, and now it's going to be at 26. And now we're basically at the end of our JavaScript section, which again is denoted by the script tags. So, and as I wanted to illustrate the fact that you can call this function either before or after it's defined, it doesn't matter. And of course we could have lots of different functions as well. Now one thing we might want to be able to do, and let's clean up all this. we'll have just one single call. Let's modify the function a little bit and have a situation where we want to have two things passed back. So let's change this to, we'll call it my square and divide. So we could pass back two values instead. Let's pass back x times x and x divided by 2, for example. In fact, maybe a better name for this would be my square half. So now if we were to try to do this, if you were to accidentally do this, the only thing it's going to do is pass back the last value, which in this case is x divided by 2. So the value y would be 2.5. If you want to pass back two values, you have to put it inside of an array, and so now that will pass both of those values, but it'll actually end up showing up in, so y will end up being an array with those two values in it. But if we, and here, we'll stop the previous debug and run, and I'll show you that happening. Now note too that since we made some changes there, it had left a breakpoint on the function definition. Again, that's not really technically an executable code, it's a definition, so it is going to, it actually removed the breakpoint because it wasn't valid at that point. And so now what you can see is as soon as we execute this line of code, it says my SQU is not defined. So as I was making those changes, I had forgotten to change the value, the name of my called function. So in this particular case, it was looking for my SQU. It doesn't exist. So we end up with this error. And now note too that if you have, sometimes you could actually have a complicated program, you can have a whole list of errors, and what's very helpful is regardless of where you're at, you can just double click on this error itself and it will take you to that particular line of code so that you can fix it. So in this case, all we have to do is, that didn't help, copy that value, copy the name so that we now have the correct name for our call in this particular case. Alright, so let's try that again. Let's restart. So now we haven't executed that line yet, and it's gone to the function. It's going to return those values, and now we're finding that y is an array consisting of 25 and 2.5, which is exactly what we had said. But let's say, now we could individually use indexing to pull those values out, but there's kind of a, if we wanted to have those two values in two different variables, but there's a kind of a neat trick you can do here, is we can say, use an array notation, and let's say we'll put this into y and z. So now what will happen, and we can demonstrate this, so this is our first and only executable line of code outside the function. So now we're going to call the function, and we're still passing in 5. So our argument is 5, and it becomes it's passed into the parameter x, and then we're going to pass back an array which is x times 2 and x divided by 2. And so we come back to our calling function here, and let's see what happens. So value of y is 25, the value of z is 2.5. So that's a nice, really nice, easy method to pass multiple parameters back from a function. Now also keep in mind, like I said, we could have multiple values passed into this as well. And at this point, it's really important to note these variables. The variables they have what's called scope. Now, in this particular case, the scope of x is confined to inside this function. So if we were to try to find the value of x outside, and we can do that using our watch. So if I down here add x to watch, we can see that value is not available, doesn't exist. So that's actually called local scope. So a variable that's defined, another way we can define a variable using the var command, we could define a variable u and set that equal to 5. But we will see that, again, outside of that, add that to our watch list, we'll see that that variable does not exist outside the scope, or even basically it's outside of these curly braces that define our function. So now that's a locally defined variable. We can define a variable globally. So if the variable is defined outside the function, it's called a global variable. We'll call this global variable g, and we'll give it a value of, say, 7. And we'll restart our program. And now, I had changed the parameter list to have 2 values, but I didn't actually define that one in my call here. So I would actually have to put another value as an argument to be passed in, or I can just go back and fix the change that I made. And we'll try to run that again. So now we have a reference error that says y is not defined. So turns out it wasn't actually that value. The problem it's having is with this y. So let's try to define y and execute that again. So now we're actually not doing anything with this u, but I'm leaving it in there just to demonstrate the fact that the function is that the variable defined inside that function is local. So now we see that both of those, we have our value x has a value, and y and u has a value. We see that over here. They both have the value 5. When I do a return, it's going to pass the value of x divided by 2 into z, and x times x into y, like we said before. But again, note the fact that x and u are not available, but we do have these global variables up here, and we can actually go through these, but unfortunately it can take some time to go through and find, because there's a whole bunch of other methods and variables associated with the with that global context. So there's quite a few things in here. So it's even though they will show up in the list, there's our G, for example. It's just too many other things in here, so it doesn't make it too valuable. So instead, I might be better off adding here. So now, one of the things I want to talk about now is the formatting. So far, I've shown you this function call, function definition that uses the curly braces, and notice the curly brace is here at the end, and then the closing brace is down here, lined up with function. There's different ways to do the formatting. What I recommend for beginning programmers, and actually this is my preferred formatting method, is to line up the braces. It makes it very easy to keep track of because of the alignment. You can easily see them line up, and because the environment actually adds a little line there when you're working with it. You see that line? It just kind of helps you line those up and keep track of them. When you start getting into multiple braces inside of each other, it becomes very easy to lose track of which is which, and it also makes it a lot easier to make changes. So again, this becomes a religious argument for some programmers. A lot of people prefer it the other way. I think this is much preferable, again, especially for beginning programmers, because of the way it visually lines up. Now, note that when I clicked out, I actually put that back. So what because I have automatic formatting set up. What I want to do is change my formatting so that it will automatically follow that method. And again, now it kind of settles the religious argument if the system automatically reformats it the way you like, and we can do that. So we can just search for open brace and just come in here and check all of these items that are associated with open braces. So what it's doing is it's going to change that formatting slightly. Okay, so now we can move this. Oops. Move this out of the way, close my settings. So we can see now, if after I've clicked out of here, it's supposed to reformat it for me. So let's try that. So there we go. Now when we find a function, it's going to automatically put the braces lined up the way that I prefer. Okay, that's about it for functions.